Previously on the story, the frail Sheng Jiaoyue ventured alone to the plum grove on the back mountain, captivated by the sight of blooming red plums. Unexpectedly, young General Pei Lang, observing from a distance, mistook him for a young lady, leading to confusion and mockery. Crown Prince Wei Jing and heir Gu Qinglin, understanding the real situation, revealed Sheng Jiaoyue's true identity with a cold smile. He was not a delicate young lady but rather the young master sent by the Sheng family to monitor court activities by staying close to the crown prince. Behind this revelation lay hidden conflicts of courtly power struggles and personal grievances. Chapter 8. On a sunny day after the snow on the eaves gutter melted into cold droplets, trickling down the eaves veins and dripping down to the corridor. The bright and warm yellow sunlight shone on the thick snow. In no time, the ice chips on the stone slab ground gradually melted away. A young monk was sweeping the snow in the courtyard with a broom. There were heavy guards, both in front of and behind the courtyard gate. The neatly arranged, strict, solemn, and cold personal guards stood expressionless on both sides. It was difficult for even a fly to fly in. The cold wind was whistling. Pei Lang had an extremely cold look in his starry eyes, and his voice was low.
That old fox, Grand Secretary Zhang, is getting a bit restless now. He sent a large number of men to the border town a few days ago to take my grandfather's life.
When mentioning this matter, Pei Lang's eyebrows and eyes instantly turned gloomy, and his whole body was filled with murderous intent.
My father's health hasn't been good in the past 2 years either. I've killed quite a number of spies on my way here. I suppose the Zhang family won't let it go easily.
Wei Jing simply replied with a low, He lowered his eyelids, looking so calm that it was impossible to tell what he was thinking. After a while, Xing Kuan came to report that they had captured the man who had behaved furtively and run away last night outside the temple. But even after careful interrogation, they couldn't get any useful information. He wanted to ask the crown prince how this man should be dealt with. Wei Jing raised his eyelids. His eyes were pitch black and without any emotion.
Drain his blood and hang him on the plaque of the Zhang family's main gate before dawn tomorrow.
Xing Kuan accepted the order.
Yes.
The crown prince had never been a kind-hearted and gentle person. Sheng Jiaoyue rushed back to the side room, panting slightly. Her snow-white hibiscus-like face was tinged with a thin layer of rosy color. She was still in shock. When her breathing gradually became steady, she raised her hand to wipe the cold sweat that had been scared out of her with a plain handkerchief. She wasn't sure whether the crown prince and the others had seen her or not. Those few glances just now were all rather unfriendly. Cold, as if looking at something dead. Sheng Jiaoyue drank 2 cups of tea absent-mindedly. After she came to her senses, she still had a lingering fear. She was weak, and most of the time her face was somewhat sickly pale. Just now, she had run quickly for a while, and her pale skin seemed to be smeared with light-colored powder. Her lips were also bitten by herself to show a ruddy color, adding a rare charm to her cool and peerlessly beautiful temperament. The girl's hands hidden in her sleeves were trembling slightly. It was really Pei Lang. This young general, who was young but already had numerous military achievements, was truly audacious and appeared in the capital without letting anyone know. Sheng Jiaoyue didn't know who the person who informed and exposed this matter in her previous life was. She only knew that the person died a tragic death, with eyes gouged out, ears cut off and limbs mutilated. She made up her mind not to get involved in these matters. When she went home and her father asked her about it, she would never mention that she had bumped into the young general in the temple. After the winter snow melted, the air at night carried a biting and icy coldness. Before going to sleep, Sheng Jiaoyue lit the smoking cage as usual and stuffed the hand warmer filled with hot water into the quilt. She didn't take off her clothes and climb into bed until the quilt got warm. With the heat source under her feet, her body didn't seem as cold as before. She wrapped the quilt tightly around herself, lay on her side with her eyes closed, and slowly fell asleep. In the middle of the night, the sleeping girl suddenly frowned. Her face was pale, and her pinkish-white fingernails tightly grasped the bedding on her chest. She looked somewhat painful, and was moaning indistinct words. Sheng Jiaoyue had a nightmare. In the dungeon, the icy cold air penetrated into her bones, through her skin. Her limbs were cold, and her thin and frail body was shivering. Her fingers were tightly grasped by a man and held firmly in his palm. He took her to the torture chamber and whispered coldly in her ear.
Lord Sheng, watch carefully for me.
The cold and damp dungeon was filled with a thick smell of blood, mixed with the rusty smell of decaying raw meat. The new emperor released her hand, tied the cloak on her tightly, and helped her put on her hat by the way, so that others couldn't see her face. The girl's body was shaking. She didn't know whether it was because of fear or the cold. The man chuckled.
What are you afraid of?
He held a long whip between his well-defined thumbs, walked into the cell. In no time, extremely painful wails and pleas for mercy came from inside. Her legs were stiff. Standing outside the cell and listening to the screams of pain inside, she seemed to be getting colder and colder. She clenched her teeth and straightened her calves so that she didn't fall down. The cold sweat constantly emerging from her forehead dampened the broken hair at her temples. After a while, the man covered in blood slowly walked out of the cell. He casually threw the long whip to the attendants behind him. The dim candlelight barely illuminated the man's cold and handsome face, his hard jawline. His eyes shifted slightly, and just one faint glance from him carried an intimidating deterrence. He stepped forward, grasped the girl's slender waist, wrapped his arm around her body in an overbearing manner, lowered his head, turned his face sideways and kissed her soft, pink earlobes twice. His warm breath slipped into her neck. The girl seemed to have a hazy moistness in her eyes. Her pupils were filled with a watery mist, and she looked innocent and pitiful. The man pinched her chin, looked at the fear in her eyes, and finally softened his heart and didn't make her go in to see the tortured person.
Will you dare to do it again?
The person who had been tortured by him in the cell and was on the verge of losing his life was the one she had instigated to take her away. Her waist seemed to be almost pinched off by him. Before she could say a word, she was so frightened that she passed out. Sheng Jiaoyue clearly hadn't been tortured, but in the dream, she also felt pain all over her body. Sharp stabs of pain spread to the back of her head, and her lower abdomen hurt as if it were being pressed hard on a pinboard. It was in this stabbing pain that she slowly woke up. She curled up in the quilt, clenched her teeth on her lips tightly, and was sweating profusely. She endured the throbbing pain in her lower abdomen and slowly sat up. The candlestick beside the bed was still burning with a faint yellow light, the candlewick was almost used up and the flame wasn't very bright. Sheng Jiaoyue's lower abdomen was painful and swollen. She lifted the quilt and saw that the bedsheet was stained with blood. She took a deep breath in shock. She had her period. Her menstrual cycle had never been regular. This month, it had come a full 7 days earlier. Sheng Jiaoyue sat on the bed, at a loss for a moment, not knowing what to do. After a while, Sheng Jiaoyue endured the physical discomfort and got out of bed. She changed the soiled bedsheet. However, she had been in such a hurry when she went out that day that she hadn't thought of bringing menstrual pads. There was nothing in this side room. She closed her eyes and thought for a while, then found a pair of scissors, cut some white cloth, and sewed them together to make do temporarily. Early the next morning, they got ready to return to the city. Sheng Jiaoyue's typhoid fever had mostly recovered. The beautiful sunlight shone with a warm yellow glow obliquely, bringing a burst of warmth. She wore a plain long shirt inside, and draped over her was His Highness the Crown Prince's black cloak with emerald-patterned brocade and feather satin. She had rosy lips and white teeth, yet didn't look in good spirits. Her lower abdomen was still hurting badly. Every time she had her period, she would be in such agony, as if on the verge of death. Now all she wanted was to return home quickly, drink some sweet soup and then have a sleep. Before she knew it, Gu Qinglin had walked up behind her. The man was dressed in a moon-white long robe, with his hair tied up in a coronet. He had delicate features and was handsome and otherworldly. He raised his eyebrows, and his fox-like eyes narrowed slightly.
Is young Master Sheng still unwell? You look a bit pale.
Sheng Jiaoyue had to exchange greetings with him. She habitually put on a serious little face and replied with a frown.
Thank you for your concern, young master. The typhoid fever is no longer a serious problem.
Hearing this, Gu Qinglin sneered coldly in his heart. His scrutinizing gaze fell on the young man, and he looked him up and down carefully. For some reason, he remembered that he had mistaken him for a woman yesterday evening. His heart leaped to his throat, and a feeling of being fooled took over his mind, which had been annoying him until now. However, Sheng Jiaoyue really had a face that was hard to distinguish between male and female. His features were delicate and pretty, especially his eyes, which were pitch black, moist, clear and bottomless. His skin was extremely fair, and there was not a single flaw in his facial features. All his advantages seemed to be shown on his face.
Young Master Sheng has such delicate skin and tender flesh and is as weak as a willow. You should still take good care of yourself.
When Gu Qinglin said this to him, the malice in his words was quite obvious, and he was not being kind at all. The cold wind blew directly around them. The strong wind blew against their faces, making people's heads ache. Sheng Jiaoyue was not feeling well. Her stomach hurt and her head ached from the wind. Facing the young master's veiled sarcasm, she didn't have the mood to deal with him, nor the energy to spar with him. Sheng Jiaoyue showed a look of impatience.
Young master should care more about yourself.
Gu Qinglin was taken aback by her retort as if he had seen something rare. Sheng Jiaoyue had always been a bit timid, polite to others, good-tempered and patient, and spoke gently, not daring to offend people easily. Today was the first time that Gu Qinglin had seen Sheng Jiaoyue lose her temper. He didn't know if she dared to behave like this in front of the Crown Prince. Gu Qinglin was too lazy to pay more attention to her. The jade thumb ring between his thumbs was turned casually twice. He took a deep look at him with his deep and mysterious eyes and got into the carriage without saying a word. As the sun rose higher, the dazzling sunlight was so bright that it was hard to open one's eyes. However, it was still very cold. The blowing wind was as merciless as a slap in the face. Xing Kuan, who looked fierce and fierce, walked up to the young man with an expressionless face. His gaze when looking at him was rather cold. In a cold and rigid tone that adhered to businesslike principles, he said,
Master Sheng, you get on the carriage first.
Almost at the same time as he approached her, Sheng Jiaoyue smelled the thick smell of blood on him. She lowered her eyes and glanced at the long sword on Xing Kuan's waist. The blade was sharp and the bloodstains had been wiped clean. She endured the discomfort and slightly opened her cherry lips.
I'm afraid I'll pass my illness to His Highness the Crown Prince. Is there an extra carriage?
Xing Kuan knitted his cold brows.
There isn't.
When the Crown Prince went out, he always traveled simply. Besides, the winding mountain road was very difficult to walk on. How could there be an extra carriage? Xing Kuan had followed the Crown Prince for many years and was a tough guy who had seen a sea of blood and countless people. He coldly glanced at this noble young master who was as weak as a chicken. He sneered in his heart and couldn't help but suspect that perhaps he just didn't want to enjoy the comfort of having a carriage all to himself. Thinking like this, Xing Kuan became even more impatient. With a fierce and murderous face, the scar on his brow looking particularly murderous, he said,
Master Sheng, you'd better hurry up.
Sheng Jiaoyue had no choice but to climb onto the carriage. She didn't dare to make her movements of lifting her legs too big and slowly got into the carriage compartment. Xing Kuan coldly watched him struggling to climb onto the tall carriage and had no intention of giving him a hand at all. Seeing his slow and clumsy movements, he was quite disgusted. Except for having a pretty face, this man was useless. Sheng Jiaoyue found a comfortable position and sat down in the carriage. A warming stove was lit in the carriage compartment and the windows were tightly closed, so it didn't feel cold. She took off her cloak and covered her legs, covering them up a little. Half an incense stick later, the curtain of the carriage was lifted from the outside. The man sat down beside her, carrying a biting coldness and a faint smell of blood on him. Wei Jing closed his eyes and rested for a moment. After a while, he slowly opened his eyes and ordered the young man beside him.
Pour me a cup of tea.
Sheng Jiaoyue silently poured tea for the Crown Prince and didn't say a word. Wei Jing gulped down a cup of tea. The rising irritability gradually subsided. He undid his cuff, casually picked up a book, looking a bit impatient in his mood, and threw it to him.
Read it.
Sheng Jiaoyue took the book and saw two big characters on the cover, the Analects of Confucius. However, when she opened the pages and clearly saw the words on the paper, she paused for a moment and then continued reading as if nothing had happened.
It is said that Zhong Lang in Hangzhou City is a good-looking pretty boy. His wedding was just around the corner, but his fiancée ran away with someone else. Depressed and unable to relieve his sorrow, Zhong Lang went to the brothel to drown his sorrows in wine. All kinds of people mixed in the brothel. In a daze, he was.
Sheng Jiaoyue really couldn't go on reading. Her mouth stuttered, and her little face had already turned bright red, her cheeks burning hot and her breath warm. Wei Jing knew something was wrong as soon as she read the first word. The book in the carriage had been replaced. Without thinking too much, it must have been the good deed done by his naughty and unruly younger sister. Wei Jing slowly opened his eyes. His pitch-black eyes stared at his flushed and pretty face. He swallowed and said coldly,
Keep reading.
Sheng Jiaoyue was so ashamed that she felt like there was nowhere to hide. She gritted her teeth and continued reading the content in the book.
He was abducted to a private room. The room was warm with the fragrance of rosemary. A pair of hands forcefully pulled open the belt around his waist. Zhong Lang thought a beauty was throwing herself into his arms. He opened his eyes with a smile, but was scared out of his wits.
She stuttered through this paragraph and was too ashamed to read the following content. However, the Crown Prince didn't give her a chance to avoid it.
Continue.
Sheng Jiaoyue lowered her head and stammered intermittently in her embarrassment.
At first, Zhong Lang still wanted to resist. Later, gradually, got interested and was.
The Crown Prince's face remained unchanged.
Was what?
Was so carried away. She couldn't lift her head, her face blushed with shame, and her ears also turned red. She couldn't bring herself to read it out. Wei Jing silently admired the young man's watery eyes, which seemed to be the tears forced out by shyness. Sheng Jiaoyue returned the book with trembling hands. She was suffering from the pain in her lower abdomen and just took the physical discomfort as an excuse to get out of it. The Crown Prince took the book, and his indifferent eyes casually scanned through the whole text. His face remained unchanged, calm and composed. He closed the book, and his lazy and casual eyes slowly landed on his face, staying there for a few seconds. Suddenly, a light chuckle broke through the quiet air. Sheng Jiaoyue covered her stomach, looking dazed, as if she didn't understand what he was laughing at. Wei Jing originally thought that he had made up an excuse, because he didn't want to continue reading to fool him. However, seeing his face getting paler at the moment, it didn't seem like he was lying. Wei Jing asked,
Does your stomach hurt?
Sheng Jiaoyue lied.
My head hurts.
Wei Jing raised his eyebrows.
Really?
He didn't ask any more questions. Sheng Jiaoyue didn't dare to make big movements. Just slightly lifting her buttocks would make the blood rush out. She was looking forward to being sent to the Sheng family as soon as possible. As soon as the carriage entered the city gate, Sheng Jiaoyue just let out a sigh of relief when Wei Jing suddenly said,
You will stay and rest in the Crown Prince's mansion tonight. In 2 days, I will have someone send you back.
Sheng Jiaoyue was a spineless and brainless fool. If he told his father about seeing Pei Lang in the temple, it would be quite troublesome. Instead of that, it would be better to detain him directly. Wait until Pei Lang left the capital and then send him back to the Sheng family. Sheng Jiaoyue's little face turned deathly pale, and she was in a panic. As soon as she got nervous, the pain in her lower abdomen became even worse.
Next chapter preview, Sheng Jiaoyue, disguised as a man, crosses paths with Princess Xinghua, who secretly admires the Crown Prince. What sparks will fly between them? Will it be jealousy, misunderstanding, or something entirely unexpected? Make sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next update. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up to let me know how excited you are for the story. See you next time.